Hello, and we're here for some 1v1 Airmech on the map Thar. On the blue team we have nCxJoE versus Megahertz on the green team. Trying to do something a little bit different here because we usually have multiple people on each team, but we're going to do a 1v1 here. And we'll see how the tactics that you employ change when you're on your own. Because usually in a 2v2 or 3v3, you've got 3 people maybe with different sorts of loadouts and different units, whereas on a 1v1 it's just the 8 units that you've selected on your loadout and you're on your own. So here we have the usual to be expected. We have nCxJoE here deploying the moneymakers on the nodes at the start, which is of course a very good tactic. We have Megahertz, I assume, probably doing the same. Yep, we see that. And nCxJoE has started pushing for this point. He has actually been taken down by those pretty strong units. The neutral units at the start of the games are pretty strong. Those are Seekers, and they take out Airmechs pretty easily. But we do see both teams actually managing to take their undefended second outpost. However, the Greens have managed to take their neutral outpost on the left of their base, and the Blues have managed to do the same. But the only difference here is trying to take out those neutral units in the early game, as that's very difficult because those Seekers will usually take out the Airmechs very easily. But seeing as though they are Seekers, if you drop in a tank or maybe a T-99 turret in there, they will wipe out those neutral units, as the Seekers can't actually target ground units. We see here we have Megahertz trying to push for the middle here, which is of course a very pivotal position in this map. But seeing as though it's a 1v1, you can employ some tactics that otherwise would be pretty difficult to pull off in a 3v3 or a 2v2, such as maybe surprise drop-offs into the back of the enemy base, because there aren't multiple enemy mechs to be worrying about. It's just a 1v1, so you could go around deploying units into the back of the enemy base. You could go off deploying capture units to capture the back outposts of the enemy to sort of distract them and get them away from the actual post that you want, which is probably the middle section. So we see here Megahertz trying to clear out his side of the central position by taking out the neutral longhorns. We see nCxJoE over here taking over one of the side positions, which are actually pretty good positions to take because they will actually generate you extra money, so they are definitely worth taking. And you don't usually see much combat around them. It's usually very much the central position. But as you can see, Megahertz here is certainly pushing for the central position and is probably going to be the one to capture it. As we see over here, we do actually see nCxJoE trying to put in his probes here, which are the fastest capture unit. They have no weapons, of course, and they are completely undefended, but he is actually going to capture this position, putting down a extra Gemini there to take out the Seekers, which can't do anything about that. So as we can see from nCxJoE, he is actually using a very forceful tactic, as it lags out there a little bit. He is pushing behind enemy lines, and he is trying to disrupt Megahertz's push on the central position, which I think he's doing pretty well, because he is actually going to manage to capture this section, I believe, because even if Megahertz manages to take it back, nCxJoE has deployed a few Gemini tanks to actually protect it and stop him from putting any defences down. But we do see Megahertz desperately attempting to do this, which is just essentially, because as you can see, this base over here is completely undefended. So nCxJoE's neutral capture units will eventually make it over to this outpost and take it, whilst Megahertz is dealing with this disturbance that nCxJoE has created. We see him dropping off some more probes, and we see Megahertz deploying his own Gemini turret, which has been taken out, but he's going to be very persistent. Now he's going to actually drop onto the ground and try and take that out. We see nCxJoE trying to heal his Gemini turrets there, which you can do by hovering them over your command posts, your outposts, any outposts or your main base that you control. And we see Megahertz must have been keeping an eye on this, or his neutral units have actually been deciding to go down in there. I think these units over here are actually going and keeping this neutral, keeping this on Megahertz's side. But as we see, nCxJoE has actually managed to control this point. He is definitely showing his authority, and in the meantime, Greens have actually managed to take this point and keep some of the neutral mobs on the side of nCxJoE, so in case he did want to take it, it's very difficult for him because he would have to take out those neutral mobs. And over on this bridge, Megahertz even might want to think about pushing his Gemini forward to protect this base a bit more, maybe blocking the entrances for capture units, because those 3 neutral units there will keep the blue team's capture units from actually gaining entrance into this central point. So he might want to think about blocking these door entrances here with his very own Gemini tanks, which won't actually be targeted by these because they won't be in line of sight. And they do of course have a patcher there to protect them. So he's going to deploy a T-99. That would be a very bad position to put it, as it would get targeted by 2 Longhorns and a Jackal. That's a very good position to put it in, as I wasn't aware that that could happen, but his T-99 there is actually firing through the base. That might be a bug. This game is in beta, so it's to be expected. That is a pretty poorly placed Seeker that will probably get taken out by that Longhorn. He's keeping a very good strong position on here, so nCxJoE might want to think about either pushing to attack here, and this is actually what he's doing. He is deploying a Gemini turret in the back of the base in order to distract our friend Megahertz here, who is using lovely cyan coloured missile chasers. Megahertz does definitely have to do something about this problem here, because it is slowly depleting his health here. We go over to the main position. He could probably do the same himself. I don't know what nCxJoE's defense is like. That is a good enough defense, actually, to hold off an attack by Megahertz. And Megahertz is just not doing anything about this. Maybe he thinks those Seekers will actually do damage to those tanks, but they're not going to. And it's literally just taken 2 Gemini tanks to actually attack the main base of the enemy, which you quite often actually see in games at the current state of tactics of most people. People usually tend to neglect the defense of their main base until someone employs a tactic like this. It usually takes someone to wipe out half of your main base health until you actually decide to put some defenses down. And we see Megahertz has deployed a Seeker and a T-99, which still isn't sufficient enough defense. As Megahertz, if I was in Megahertz's position, I would be thinking I should probably put down some more defenses here. Seeing as though he's only controlling the central point and another outpost along with his main base, he probably doesn't have a very good income at the moment. Whereas nCxJoE controls Megahertz's left outpost, as well as the farmost left outpost, as well as the 2 outposts to the left and right of his base, and his main base, which is going to be meaning that nCxJoE is feeling pretty wealthy at this point. And that shows by the fact that he can just keep on deploying these Gemini into Megahertz's base and doing that damage. That critical damage, as we can see, is probably going to be a game over here, as nCxJoE could literally just run around that base and just keep firing into that, and I think that is exactly what he's going to do, because he's easily going to be able to destroy it, as those T-99s are too distracted on that Gemini. But he does in fact bail out, but I imagine he will be back straight away. There we go, we see him coming back. Is he not going to take out the base? I'm pretty surprised by that. He could very easily do it. He could very easily just pick up some of these, or even deploy them and send them in there and destroy the main base very, very easily, but it doesn't seem like he wants to do that. As you can see from up there, Megahertz's base does have a very small amount of health. I think Megahertz actually took out nCxJoE there. Yep, as we see him being rebuilt there. And the only thing that could save Megahertz, of course, from almost certain defeat in this situation would be a lunchbox to build up the shield of his main base. However, he does not have one, so he is very, very squidgy at this point, but he has managed to drop off some capture units into his leftmost outpost and recapture that, but it is well defended by 4 Gemini and a T-99. As we can see in the build log of nCxJoE, he is building some probes to try and take that back. He's got a substantial army of Gemini here, which he could move into this base, and I imagine he probably will move them into this base. Megahertz trying to put a Seeker down. His Seekers are very... His placing of his Seekers are quite terrible, to be honest. They're not really doing what they should. They're not really getting the desired effect that Megahertz is probably hoping for. And if we look over here, we haven't actually seen anyone pushing for this point. Maybe Megahertz's neutral mobs will actually capture it, but sometimes these two positions on this map are very underutilized. They don't seem to be really fought over that often, probably because they don't really, especially this point over here. This is essentially a point, because any units you actually make at this point, you will have to pick them up and deploy them over here, else they'll just be stuck on there forever. If you have any NPC capture units on there, they'll just be running around, just standing near the edges of this cliff, and they won't be able to do anything, which would be wasting your unit points. As we see, nCxJoE has actually managed to capture this point back. I think he has just been taken out by Megahertz. Yep, oh no, I think he's been taken out by a tank or a Seeker. As we see, we got some tangos going down here, hoping to push at the enemy base. We did see Megahertz making some small pushes at the enemy, but they haven't been doing very much. The tangos, they are very quick units, but their only real use is very early game, trying to take out capture units of the enemy so that you can have that extra push at the start of the game. But at this mid to end game scenario, they're not really the prime unit that Megahertz should be creating. He should definitely be creating some tanks. Both players have actually got Gemini in their loadouts. Am I right in saying that? Yes, I am. Megahertz does not have Goliaths in his loadout, which is very bizarre. I would question a player that doesn't have Goliaths in their loadout, as they are the strongest unit you can get. So, in my opinion, they are a must-have. As we can see, these Gemini are distracted, so they might not be able to take out those sounds, but they have managed to. See, nCxJoE setting up a small defense here. Megahertz is trying to make some sort of T-99 push onto this outpost, but I really don't know what nCxJoE is doing. Maybe he's waiting to build up to level 7. Maybe he's just playing with Megahertz, because he could literally just fly in to the back of here. He wouldn't be targeted by T-99s, unless of course they manage to fire through the base, which they shouldn't be able to do. But he could get in here. That is a very small amount of damage that he has to do. He could very easily just wipe out Megahertz here and now, but they are deciding to have a little push here. And that's another thing. Sometimes teams believe they are so far in the lead and they're doing so well that they throw all manner of common sense and tactics out the window, and they actually just try and push. And sometimes that isn't the best thing to do. Sometimes that actually gets you into a really bad position where the people who you think are doing the worst actually end up getting the upper hand, which looks like what's happening here with Megahertz and nCxJoE actually. Because Megahertz is actually holding his own pretty well, and he's making some good units. He's deploying multiple T-99s, which are very strong and very good. But there we see at the top of that base we have nCxJoE with his Goliath. If he had picked it up right then, at that moment, that Goliath would have been destroyed. But as you can see, nCxJoE is swimming in the cash. He's got 3 Goliaths on his creation menu, which will definitely destroy Megahertz's defense. And I imagine Megahertz, if he knows what he's doing, he will be thinking, nCxJoE, he's level 7 now, he's probably going to be building some Goliaths. As we see there, he has taken that base. He could move these T-99s in with the patches and take out that final unit. We do have a Goliath drop there, which is going to do some monumentous damage to any units that Megahertz wants to place near it. Very bad positioning of a T-99 there. So that Goliath is going to take it out with relative ease, accompanied by that Gemini. But we do have a Patcher and T-99 combination here, which means that T-99 lasts a little bit longer than it should. But now that has been wiped out, now Gemini is getting targeted by those, and I don't think that Goliath or the Gemini are in a good position to fire upon it. Now nCxJoE has taken this Goliath push at an advantage to take back this base. He has got another few Goliaths on standby, and he's creating another one, and he did take out Megahertz just there. So Megahertz is going to be feeling a bit sore after this one. But as we can see up here, Megahertz has actually managed to take this base and clear out the neutron mobs, but he's done nothing with the base because he's probably been far too distracted by nCxJoE, who has been fighting over this post for pretty much the whole match. But yes, he has managed to take this base as well, but again, not being used for anything. But I guess that is giving Megahertz an advantage, as he is reducing the amount of money that nCxJoE is receiving. But still, this man must be completely loaded, because he's bringing out 3 more Goliaths, and he is actually moving in. If he gets taken out before he drops that Goliath, then that Goliath is gone for good, and that's a waste of 16,500 resources. Now we're going to see how good this Goliath fares against these 6 T-99s. It is going to be targeting that T-99. I don't know if it will target the rest of them. I think it's just going to target the main base. It is just going to target the main base, and it is going to do some monumentous damage, and that is a victory, finally, for nCxJoE over Megahertz. GG, as the Goliath destroys everything in its path.